And before we begin our program today, what I'd like to do is just to talk a little bit about the ICCF and some of our partners, just a quick overview, and then we'll get into our program. I see a lot of new faces here, so some people might not know about our organization or the U.S. Congressional International Conservation Caucus here on Capitol Hill. So hopefully this will answer some of your small questions, and I will be available afterwards if anybody wants to talk more about the ICCF or the ICC. This is, in a nutshell, if you will, a pretty long mission statement. It's the ICCF's belief that as America has exported freedom, democracy, and free enterprise, that we have the ability and the interest to see that America also exports good natural resource management. The whole concept behind the ICCF is that good natural resource management and biodiversity protection is an integral, important part of poverty alleviation, sustainable economic development, regional security, conflict avoidance in the developing world, and overall globally is extremely important to global fresh water security, global food security, and also global health. And so those are the issues that we really deal with, linking good natural resource management, biodiversity protection to these other issues and their critical components. This is quite a list. We're pretty proud of it, and this is most of our partners that we work with on a day-to-day basis at the ICCF. The four top ones really were instrumental in helping launching our foundation and make up our advisory council, and that's Conservation International, which we will hear from today, the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, and the Wildlife Conservation Society. What we do throughout our congressional briefing series is to showcase success stories and potential opportunities for conservation from the corporate and NGO sector, as well as the government sector, and what they're doing and what some of their viewpoints on how the U.S. can lead more on these issues. We have just recently launched a new part of the ICCF. You saw our partners back here made up of NGOs, corporations, and intergovernmental organizations. This new part is the Conservation Council of Nations, and I know we have a couple of, I know Morocco's here today represented. I think we also have, I believe, somebody from the Embassy of Honduras as well. The Conservation Council of Nations is really kind of was the missing ingredient to the entire ICCF structure of bringing together NGOs, corporations, and governments in the pursuit of strong natural resource management and biodiversity protection. We've got 22 members so far, and we are going to be expanding that list and officially launching this Council of Nations in the spring. So a lot of exciting developments on that front. Hoping to build international consensus and supporting developing nations with biodiversity protection and sustainable economic development. The U.S. Congressional ICC has been around since 2003. The leadership there is at the bottom. Some of those folks will be leaving the Hill for other jobs. Others will be coming to fill their places. I've been told that the U.S. Congressional International Conservation Caucus is actually the second or third largest caucus on Capitol Hill. I think it's behind the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus Foundation, which is our sister organization, we like to say. It's comprised of more than a third of the U.S. House of Representatives and about a fifth of the Senate. And the most important and critical thing about this entire caucus is that of its bipartisan nature of bringing together conservatives, liberals, Democrats, and Republicans that are interested in these issues and trying to push forth more U.S. leadership. We've got caucus lists outside and in the Partners in Conservation brochure that you might have picked up. If you're here today and your member of Congress that you're working for is not a member of the caucus, we would strongly encourage him to become a member. It's just asking to get his ear on these issues, if you will. It's no policy. It's not signed up for any specific policy implementation. Well, with no further ado, I'm going to introduce today's briefing, which I hope is going to showcase some of the opportunities, shortfalls, and success stories of the Mekong Delta. Today we have with us Conservation International, one of our advisory council and founding members. I'd like to probably also introduce a few other people in the room. I don't know if David from our partners, I kind of skipped this. David Crane from Autodesk is here. They've been our new partners. We've got people from TNC in the room. Peter Jenkins from CI, who is just been is their new government affairs person. You'll be seeing a lot of him. We've also got Janine Kelly from Coca-Cola, which is a new a partner of the ICCF. So Conservation International is going to be represented by Dr. Tracy Farrell. She's the Senior Director of the Freshwater Initiative, as you can see up there, and she can tell you a little bit about herself. But what I can tell you is that she has been at the helms of projects in freshwater and ecosystem services and wildlife trade for the past 5 years, and she's spent 10 years aligning research and field activities on several continents on these issues. After Tracy, we're going to be having Dr. Richard Cronin, who's the Senior Associate and Director of Southeast Asia Programs at the Stimson Center talk, and he is the lead co-author of a book entitled, and documentary entitled, Mekong Tipping Point, Hydropower Dams, Human Security, and Regional Stability. So thank you for Georgetown Cupcakes and Starbucks, both a supporter of ours for the food today, and I will now set it up for Tracy.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you to ICCF and to John especially for hosting this and getting it organized. So this is going to be sort of a two-part series. I'm going to kick off and share with you some of the issues of global freshwater security and linking that to the conservation and development challenges on the Mekong River. And then my colleague and friend Rich is going to talk a lot more about sort of the context of infrastructure development and pressures on the Mekong system and some exciting new advances that have been coming online from the U.S. government and other partners. To introduce myself a bit more, I am the lead of our freshwater security initiative at Conservation International. And the way that we look at this at CI is that we're concerned about the sources of water flows that come from natural ecosystems. So where does the water come from, who's benefiting from it, and where? And how do you quantify these different values and make sure that people and species are thriving from healthier ecosystems? So we have to ask ourselves from a global perspective, is there enough fresh water on Earth? So we tend to think of fresh water as a renewable resource, which it is, but you have to get a context for how little of it that there is on the planet. So what this graph basically says is that there are 24 plus billions of cubic kilometers of fresh water, or of water on Earth, but only about 3% of that is fresh. There's a very tiny fraction. So getting from this very large volume to the 3% that's fresh, less than 1% of that is surface water. So you can imagine all these conflicting needs for this tiny amount of water, which is equivalent to a marble compared to a classroom-sized globe. So we're all competing for this. We need this water to drink, to bathe ourselves, for hydroelectricity, to cleanse our waste, remove pollutants. And species also depend upon this. Some 126,000 plus species need this water to survive. So a lot of the threats and challenges that are present on the global sphere are particularly prevalent in the Mekong. So globally, we know that some of the largest drivers and threats to freshwater provision are agriculture, which uses about 70% of the surface water available on the planet. So remember this tiny little fraction, and then within that, the majority of that is used for agricultural purposes. Infrastructure development, dams in particular, are also a key factor. They divert our water flows, some 2/3 of our planet's rivers. There's over 800,000 dams already built on the planet. And then we have this emerging threat of climate variation, which is going to change sort of the patterns of flooding and droughts. So when you put all of this together, it results in some pretty significant challenges to us in where we're going to get our water in reliable supplies, and how do we manage the places where it comes from. So nowhere does this all become more prevalent and important than on the Mekong. So the Mekong is one of our world's longest rivers. It's about 5,000 kilometers long. And the basin itself, the Mekong River Basin, is around 500,000 square kilometers. And the Mekong River itself is responsible for about 85% of the population's surviving and growth. So rice production, fisheries production, and a multitude of other crops. So this is a significant source of revenue for the majority of the people that live around the Mekong. And linked to the Mekong is this fascinating system called the Tonle Sap Lake in Cambodia. So the reason that I'm focusing on this is because it's a really great microcosm that talks about the challenges of conservation and development and what we can do about it. So the Tonle Sap Lake is this system that's sort of in Cambodia, and the Mekong flows into it, so you can see it kind of coming in up here. And then when the Tonle Sap gets so flooded, this happens twice a year, it actually reverses flow. So it flows upstream on the Mekong twice a year. And this dynamic is so huge for the diversity of life and for the survival of people. Rice production grows in this flooded forest plain. Fisheries production, which it's one of the 4th largest inland fisheries in the world. It's actually, I think, bigger than the U.S. and Canada fisheries combined. So this is a huge amount of production and a really unique system. It also has a tremendous amount of rare species and high biodiversity. So we've got these things like fishing cats, we've got otters, we have crocodiles, turtles, some 1,000+ species, and it has about 500 fish species that are found in this region and nowhere else on the planet. So the reason some of this is important to us is species are a really great indicator of ecosystem health. So as we start to lose some of this diversity in these key places, it's a red flag to us that we need to worry about these places like the Tonle Sap Lake and the freshwater related services and security for people. So in this region, the Tonle Sap Lake, I mentioned that this is the fourth largest inland waterway, but it's also around 12% to 16% of GDP for Cambodia alone. So this provides drinking water, fish as food, rice production, and also wood. So a lot of this flooded forest area is needed for burning wood for heat and also for building materials. So unfortunately, this is an incredibly important area for the survival of the people who depend upon it, but it's under great threat. So only around 1% of this Tonle Sap system is protected. So it's a pretty small area. Then within that, there's great illegal fishing pressure, so all sorts of techniques that are used, including dynamite fishing. And other things like clearing the flooded forest. It has a really high rate of deforestation. And this is the place where these fish spawn, and then they migrate up the Mekong River. So they've already seen a pretty big crash in the fishery production from the Tonle Sap from these pressures. And then, as my friends at the Stimson Center are going to talk a lot more about, the pressure from dam development, which is incredibly important for the production of electricity. But unfortunately, the downside is that the 134 or so dams planned in the Lower Mekong, we're already starting to see that there's going to be significant reduction of fisheries production. So it's this trade-off between upstream and downstream impacts, and what kinds of decisions do we want to make about the future of this place. So how can we turn the tide? This is a bit doom and gloom, but what can we do? So one of the things that Conservation International and other partners have been thinking about is what are the ways to make conservation relevant for development? So how can we make the right kind of arguments using solid science that it's not that we don't want to develop dams, but it's that there are ways to do this that are minimally impacting on the environment. There's ways of operating them. And there's also a question of how much electricity is needed, when, and where. So we've been engaged in a variety of different related programs to help make conservation relevant. So one is better managing these community fisheries. So the places where people are sourcing their fish for their livelihoods, how can we make sure that the stocks are going to rebound? And we're training them to do their own zoning and patrolling of the areas where they live. Also managing the flooded forest. If this is where the fish are coming from and spawning from, what are the minimum size requirements for these pools where the fish are born and thrive? And also, what are the ways we can provide alternatives to clearing the flooded forest? So things like different fuel wood stoves. So rather than burning wood, what else can we do to replace that need? And then looking at different adaptation approaches. So these communities are very used to this dynamic flood and pulse system that I mentioned. They've already gotten good at responding to periodic flooding. How can we translate that knowledge to help prepare them as climate variability increases? Then another area is balanced hydropower development and planning that has more of a sustainable development angle. So a lot of the work that the Mekong River Commission has done has moved us into gathering some significant data on this. So now it's time to begin to look at that and suggest ways of placing these dams, at what size and what scale and where, so that we can minimize some of these undesired impacts on the fisheries downstream. The last is risk management. So there's already been billions invested in poverty alleviation in this region. So what's the risk that's going to be influencing these? If we're going to be eliminating fisheries as the prime example, then the billions invested in that as a poverty alleviation strategy are all for naught. So it's raising these kinds of choices, understandings of balances and trade-off that will help us get to where we need to go. So I just wanted to summarize all this and wrap up in saying that a lot of the key messages here are that we do have a global freshwater security crisis. It is localized in certain places like the Mekong, and water is linked directly to food security and also to health security, which potentially could then lead us down other paths like political security, which is why there's been a great effort underway, the Lower Mekong initiative by U.S. government. And I have a wonderful quote from Hillary Clinton, who just attended this meeting last week in Hanoi. If I can dig it out here. Last page, wrong side of last page. So she says, the Lower Mekong Initiative meeting, we discussed how to work together to adapt to the effects of a changing climate. And we had a very constructive discussion about the potential impact of building dams on the Lower Mekong. The United States has recommended a pause before major construction continues, and we will sponsor a study on this issue. So I thank you for your time, and I will welcome my colleague Rich Cronin up to the podium.
Right after Dr. Cronin's program.
Okay, now let me get set up here with, where's my, to get me loaded there. Thanks. Yeah, great, okay, thanks. And then,
Bam. And then you're that. Back and forth.
okay, great. Well, thank you for your contribution to this, Tracy, and thank you to ICCF and John for having given me an opportunity to present at this program. Tracy was talking conservation and environmental issues, and they're all very important. There's nothing my colleague Tim Hamlin and I would say that would contradict the importance of those issues. There are some issues, though, that we're looking at that kind of take this in a slightly different direction, and that is, if I can get this to, sorry, yeah,
make things so easy. There you go.
Okay. Okay. We at Stimpson are looking at this in a slightly different way. I'm not an environmentalist. Nor is Tim or most of our colleagues. But we are looking at the Mekong and the issue of mainstream dams from the point of view of human security, food security, and regional stability. And Tracy's mentioned all of those issues in her presentation. I'm going to step away for a minute and talk about this map. The big issue in the Mekong is the issue of mainstream hydropower dams. So as Tracy mentioned, there's hundreds actually of dams being built or under construction in the Mekong region already. But except for these dams in China, most of the dams in Laos all the dams in Laos and Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam are on the tributaries of the river. So every dam has its environmental destructive environmental element to it. You can't just as soon as you block the water, you fill the water, you block the fish, you block the transfer of silt downstream, and all the other things that have to do with the environmental services of a river in exchange for electricity. So some trade-offs are better than other trade-offs. And the thing about mainstream dams is that there's never, ever a good trade-off between mainstream dams and the environment. or in this case, food security, human security. So the issue right now is that since the 80s, China has been building a series of large to mega-sized dams in Yunnan to deliver power, develop power partly for their effort to develop the southwest of China, but actually most of that power is going to the coast. It's going to Guangzhou and even Shanghai. But the main point is this is a big crash project for China. This is like their biggest national project, I would say, except for this canal they're building now from the Mekong, I'm sorry, from the Yangtze to the Yellow River. And then on the Lower Mekong, Laos and Cambodia have a plan for two clusters of dams or cascades of dams, each. The problem with Lower Mekong dams is that up here, these are mountains. You dam the river, you get a relatively narrow reservoir. There are not a lot of people depending on fishing up here, so in some ways, the higher up you go, the more tolerable these dams can be. But there's two problems that come, a couple of problems that come from this. First of all, China's dams will hold enough water behind the reservoirs when they're filled, particularly the most recent one they just completed at Shaolin. They'll have enough water to regulate the river during the dry season. And what that means is that China is trying to store water in its reservoirs to keep its own smaller dams running. I say smaller, they're big dams, but to keep them running during the dry season. The Mekong has as much as a 40-to-1 differential between the flood season, the maximum flood season, and the dry season. So you can argue why, you can see why China would want to store water as well as produce electricity. The problem with that is that this water storage and the release of water during the dry season will harm the basic hydrology of the river. These dams will hold back silt that's needed to keep the Mekong Delta rebuilt every year keep the South China Sea from intruding. So you're going to have particularly a change in the fundamental plumbing of the river, which has huge ecological, environmental circumstances. And then if Laos and Cambodia go ahead with these Lower Mekong dams, they are going to, these dams will all block the migration of fish. And Tracy's already alluded to this, that something like 70% of the commercially important fish in the Mekong depend on migration for spawning. And some of these fish, they actually spawn, they usually spawn more upstream in the dry season. They go up in the dry, and then they spawn, and they come down with the flood, and the eggs and the fry end up being pushed up into this Great Lake of Cambodia, which expands to about 4 times its dry season size. So where we're coming from on this is is that all of these issues are important, particularly the issue of agriculture and the environment, and also fisheries, which I'm already talking about. So you're talking about fisheries that have potentially as much economic value as much as $9 billion annually. And I just saw a statistic recently from the Mekong River Commission that suggested that if they build all the dams I was showing you on the Lower Mekong, that the power generated, the revenues from the sale of power from those dams would be about $4.5 billion, something like that. And so we're talking revenues of $4.5 billion in return for putting $9 billion of fish in jeopardy. Now, they wouldn't all die out, but there's a very severe number. And the problem with this, particularly with fisheries, is that some 40 to 80% of some 60 million people in the Lower Mekong Basin, particularly in southern Laos, Cambodia, and the Mekong Delta, depend on fisheries for between 40 and 80% of their animal protein. And they also, similar dependence on wet rice cultivation is the same in terms of diets. So you're talking about putting at risk the world's, actually it's the second largest inland fishery after, most productive after the Amazon. Now, where we are coming from on this is that this is an issue that becomes what we call, well, not just us, but it's become a popular term of art, a non-traditional security issue. So we're talking about food security, livelihoods, okay, and the fact that it's a transboundary issue, which then creates potential for regional instability and conflict. So that's the main thrust of what we at the Stimson are doing, sort of the kind of the human security, transboundary aspects, and potentially the hard security consequences of destroying a resource like this. Before I get into that, though, I'll just put up briefly a few things of why would they do this, right? I mean, that's a question we always get. Okay, well, if it's so bad, why would these countries do this? And well, there's a number of reasons, and one of them is this idea of 1930s thinking of Hoover Dam, great dams on the Columbia River, and that's development to them, development industrialization. The problem is in the Mekong, the potential for industrialization is except down in the delta, which would be the most severely affected, is pretty small compared to the dependence of the population on the natural services of the river. Short-term thinking, developers, and I would link that up with this commercial development profit orientation. Developer comes to a country, the government says, let us put up a dam here. You can buy in if you want, but basically it won't cost you anything, and we'll give you the revenues, you can tax it, and in 25 years we'll give it back, which they don't say. By that time we'll probably be silted up and we'll need a major work. And there is this idea, this problem of opportunistic nationalism, and countries, particularly China, says this is our river, and we'll do with it essentially what we want. They also say, well, we've never hurt our neighbor's interest, but the fact is that they are hurting a neighbor's interest, and I want to say with China, it's not a simplistic thing. In other words, there are different forces in China. There are actually some people in Beijing recognize that if they make the Mekong into another variant of the Yangtze or Yellow River, that this will have enormous blowback, political blowback. But in Yunnan province and in Kunming in the capital, the provincial government, these developers, which are very powerful, these state-owned industries are equivalent of ministries, they're very, very strongly pushing for these projects. So it's it's kind of a mixed picture. And so what we try to do is get at, okay, what are the sources of pressure? And then there's a science policy gap. That is, the leaders don't understand the consequences of these dams. And so Tim and I talked to some people at the Mekong River Commission in Vietnam a year ago, and we're saying, well, so, why don't the governments pay attention to the reports you're doing, the research you're doing? And they said, they're gathering dust because the leaders don't understand the science, and in fact, they don't want to be confronted with the science, with the fact that they can't understand it. So they don't want to have to deal with that. And I could give you examples, which I won't now, of all the ways in which, all the explanations that we've received on this issue. Okay, so the two big issues for Stimpson are the human security aspects and the regional relations and regional security implications. One of the things about the, and I don't know how to go backwards to the map, but you have the map, I think. One of the things about the system of China's dams in Yunnan, and then a cascade of dams in northern Laos, and then another cascade in southern Laos and Cambodia. One of the important things about this is that the Lao and Cambodian dams could not function. They would not be feasible without China storing enough water in the reservoirs to release more water during the dry season than would be normal. And so what you do is you set up a dependency, upstream, downstream, where, okay, for right now, we ask people, you know, in government, we say, aren't you worried about the fact that, you know, you'll be dependent on China releasing the right amount of water at the right time to keep your dams running. Otherwise, you're 3-4 months of the year, these dams can't produce any electricity, and then they would not be commercially feasible. So the issue, they'll say, well, China wants to keep its dams running. Yes, yeah, they do. But China is also facing a huge and growing water shortage, and there even talk that they're thinking about in the future diverting some water from the Mekong to the Yangtze. China may also look at the dams in terms of water storage rather than just producing power. So there's a uncertainty there about how all this would work. So we talked about impact on human and food security. With the high dependence of people in this region on the agriculture and the fisheries and the other products of the river system, you're going to have internal stability problems if food supplies dry up faster or decrease fisheries and other food production turns down faster, then new employment can be generated, and that's a big problem. Rural-urban migration, both voluntary and involuntary, and that's a big issue for regional governments. It is a security concern, or at least a domestic stability concern of most of the regional governments. One of the good things, though, is that actually in Thailand, which first started developing its water power, the opposition dams actually became the beginnings of the environmental movement in Thailand. And so the development of civil society first began around the Pak Mun Dam, a dam I won't go into, but it's a dam that's still not operating 20 years later, Tim?
It's operating, but under really strict.
Yeah, and I was going to say, it's operating, but not up to expected standards. And there's a development gap. So you cut the river, you put a dam up, you cut the river, and you decimate fisheries, even 1 or 2 or 3 dams, and that's going to take you 5 years to build the dam. It may take you another 5 to 10 years to actually develop, to be able to utilize the electricity to generate new employment. So if you have this gap, this big gap, as soon as the river's cut, almost by the first or second dam, particularly in the lower part of the river, you suddenly have a gap of, particularly with livelihoods and food security. More directly, the more direct regional relations and regional security implications include the point I already mentioned about dependence on China, about food security. Also, there's an issue of who pays the cost and who has the benefit. So in a really crude sense, Laos has most of the benefit because it doesn't really need all the electricity from mainstream dams, but it's in the business of exporting electricity to Thailand and even to Vietnam and in the future to China. So Laos has a small population. It gets the lion's share of the electricity that would be produced on the mainstream. And Cambodia, the Cambodian people, peasants, a big part of the Cambodian population will be worse off. A big part of Vietnam's population in the Mekong Delta it will be worse off than they are now. How did I get back? Sorry, everybody, I'm back to... okay. Let's talk about action, and I'd like to talk about me winding up. The MRC countries should, if they have the political will, do these things that I've mentioned. And particularly engagement with China, it's a very difficult issue, big country, small countries. They have to, we have something called the Mekong River Commission. Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam are members. Most of the funding comes from overseas and international aid donors and from the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank. There's going to be a transition next year that the current chief executive officer, CEO, he's always been in. That's always been a national job. That will transition to somebody from the Mekong countries will become the new CEO. So that transition will be very difficult because they all have to decide, okay, well, who's going to have the top job, right? There are issues of whether Laos is planning to go ahead with a project in a very near term, and it's not clear that they're going to follow the procedures they're supposed to follow for prior notification, prior consultation, and agreement. The treaty doesn't allow any country to block or veto another country's projects, but there's supposed to be this process of negotiation. And Thailand and Vietnam are the two most important countries in the picture. Thailand as the biggest market for electricity produced all over Laos in particular, and Vietnam as the downstream country, the country that will has the most to lose by interference with the river, and particularly withholding of silt and the decimation of fisheries.